My parents were buried on a Tuesday. By Friday, my brother was standing in the hallway of the home I had lived in and cared for 3 years, and he said very calmly, like it was already decided, "You should start looking for another place to stay." I was 27 years old. I had nowhere to go, and I had just lost both of my parents in the same month. If this story's already hitting you, listen closely, hit subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And trust me, this story doesn't end here. Stick with me till the very end. My name is Violet Hargrove, and before I tell you what my brother did, I need to tell you what this house was, because otherwise the thing he did won't carry its full weight, and it deserves to carry its full weight. The house on Clover Ridge Road in Asheville, North Carolina, was a 3-bedroom craftsman built in the early 1970s. It had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs that my father had repainted every few summers in the same shade of dark green, because my mother had decided once, decades ago, that dark green was the correct color for porch chairs, and she never changed her mind about it. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cedar. The hallway had a wooden coat rack my father had built by hand the first winter after they moved in, and it had been holding jackets and umbrellas and overnight bags for longer than I had been alive. Every room in that house had its own specific gravity, its own weight of memory, its own particular quality of light at different hours of the day. It was not just a property. It was the place where my parents had built their entire life. And for the last 3 years, it was where I had stayed to help them hold that life together as it grew harder to carry. My father, Gerald Hargrove, was 68 when his health began to seriously decline. He had been a structural engineer for most of his working life, precise, methodical, the kind of man who kept every receipt in a labeled folder and knew the exact age of every appliance in the house. Parkinson's came for him slowly at first, the way it does, and then with increasing confidence. By the time I moved back home in the fall of 3 years before all of this, he needed help with more than he would ever say out loud. My father was not the kind of man who asked for help. He was the kind of man who kept a detailed maintenance log for the furnace, but would rather sit in a cold room than admit the stairs were getting harder to manage. I knew this about him. I knew how to work around it, how to be useful without making him feel handled. That is its own skill. And I had learned it the way you learn things in a family, without anyone teaching it to you, just by paying attention long enough. My mother, Ruth Hargrove, had her first stroke 18 months after I moved back home. She recovered most of what she lost, but the recovery was slow and the fear that settled into her eyes afterward never fully left. She had been the kind of woman who organized neighborhood fundraisers and remembered everyone's birthdays and baked bread on Saturday mornings with the particular satisfaction of someone who believed that feeding people was a form of love. After the stroke, the baking stopped. The neighborhood calls became fewer. She would sit at the kitchen table some mornings and look out the window at the backyard with an expression I could not name, not sad exactly, but untethered, like she was searching for something that used to anchor her and finding the hook empty. I started baking bread on Saturday mornings. Not because I said anything about it, just because someone needed to, and I was there. My brother Nathan was not there. I want to be fair about this because fairness matters in the telling of true things. Nathan had his own life 4 states away in Columbus, Ohio. He had a career in commercial insurance, a mortgage, a wife named Cassandra whom everyone called Cass, and who had, from the few occasions I had met her, the energy of someone perpetually calculating the distance between what she had and what she felt she deserved. Nathan visited 4 times in 3 years. 4 times. I counted because the preparation each visit required, getting the house ready, managing my parents' anxiety about making a good impression on their own son, moderating the tension that always shimmered between Nathan and my father despite the surface pleasantness, was significant enough that each visit lodged in my memory as its own distinct event. He called on Sundays, sometimes. He sent money twice when things were tighter than usual. He was not absent in the way of someone who didn't care. He was absent in the way of someone who had decided that caring from a distance was sufficient, and who had never been forced to test that assumption against reality. Reality arrived in March. My father had a serious fall down the last 4 steps of the staircase. Early morning, before I was awake, I heard the sound from my room, and I was on my feet before I was fully conscious. He'd broken his wrist and bruised 2 ribs and sat on the floor of the hallway in his pajamas, looking more shaken than I had ever seen him look, which for Gerald Hargrove was more frightening than the injury itself. We spent most of that day in the emergency room. I called Nathan from the waiting room. He said he would try to get down within the next couple weeks. He came 6 weeks later, stayed for 4 days, and flew back to Columbus on a Sunday morning while my father was still in the wrist brace. My father's decline accelerated after the fall in the quiet way that declines do when a body has been compensating for too long and finally runs out of compensation. By summer, he was using a walker full-time. By fall, he needed help with the things that no parent wants to need help with from their child. And no child, no matter how loving, is fully prepared for. I did it anyway because he was my father, and because someone had to, and because I had made an unspoken promise to my mother with my presence in that house that I was not going to leave her to manage this alone. He died on the 14th of November, peacefully in his own bed, in the house he had lived in for 40 years. I was sitting in the chair beside him. Nathan arrived the following morning. My mother had a second stroke 10 days after we buried my father. I think grief does that sometimes, finds the places where the body is already worn thin and applies pressure. She was in the hospital for a week and came home changed in the ways that second strokes change people. She was quieter, more confused at certain hours. She needed more physical care than before, and she knew it, and the knowledge sat in her eyes alongside the grief of losing my father, and the combined weight of all of it was simply too much for a body that had already given everything it had. She died on the 9th of December, 25 days after my father. I held her hand through that too. Nathan arrived the next afternoon. Cassandra came with him this time. I had been awake for most of the previous 40 hours, managing phone calls, contacting the funeral home, notifying relatives, sitting in the particular stunned stillness that comes after a loss you were prepared for in theory, but not, it turns out, in practice. I had lost both of my parents in 25 days. I had been in that house, in that specific and sustaining grief, for every minute of those 25 days, and the 3 years before them. And on a Friday afternoon 4 days after my mother's funeral, Nathan stood in the hallway of the house where we had both grown up, looked at me with an expression that was apologetic in the way that people are apologetic when they've already decided and just need the delivery to go smoothly, and said the words I told you at the beginning of this story. You should start looking for another place to stay. I remember asking him what he meant, not because I didn't understand the words, but because some part of me needed him to say the actual thing out loud, to commit to it fully, to not be able to later claim it had been softened or misinterpreted. He said that the house was part of the estate, that there were things that needed to be sorted out legally, and that it didn't make sense for me to be living there while everything was being figured out. He said, figured out, the way you say something when the figuring has already been done, and what you mean is execution. I said, Nathan, I have lived here for 3 years. I have been here every day. I took care of them. He said he knew that, and he appreciated it, and he was sorry it had been hard. Then he told me 2 weeks would be enough time to find somewhere to go. Cassandra was in the kitchen. While this happened, I could hear her opening cabinets. The particular sound of her opening my mother's kitchen cabinets and looking through them. For days after my mother's funeral, while her husband told me to leave, that sound is one of the ones that lives permanently in the place in my memory where the worst moments live. It is a small sound. It should not have the weight it has. But context gives sounds their weight, and in that context, it was one of the loudest things I have ever heard. I did not cry in front of Nathan. I want you to know that not because I am proud of it. I am not particularly proud or ashamed of it. It was simply what happened, but because it matters for understanding what came after. Something in me went very still, not the stillness of resignation, a different kind. The stillness that comes when you understand that crying in front of a particular person will cost you more than it gives you, and that what you need right now is not the relief of breaking down, but the clarity of staying upright. I looked at my brother, and I said very evenly, I'll need more than 2 weeks. He said he thought 2 weeks was fair. I said I did not, and that I would let him know my plans when I had them. And then I walked down the hallway and into the room that had been mine for 3 years, passing the coat, rack my father had built, passing the framed photographs on the wall that Cassandra had not yet gotten to, and I closed the door. I gave myself 20 minutes to fall apart, privately, completely, with my face in my childhood pillow, so nobody would hear. Then I sat up. I pulled out my phone. I called my closest friend, Dara, who had known me since college, and who, when I told her what Nathan had said, went completely quiet for 3 seconds before saying, "Okay, listen to me. You are not doing this alone." She drove over from West Asheville that same evening with a box of her mother's sweet potato pie and a legal pad, and we sat on the floor of my bedroom making lists where I might stay, what I needed to sort out, what paperwork existed, and who I needed to call. Dara is the kind of friend who meets a crisis with organized love, and I have never been more grateful for that quality in another person than I was in that specific room on that specific night. The grief of those months had a particular texture that I want to describe honestly, because I think it is the part that people who have not lived it sometimes do not fully understand. I was not just grieving my parents. I was grieving the version of my family I had spent my whole life believing in, the one where sacrifice was noticed, where loyalty was reciprocated, where staying meant something to the people you stayed for. Losing that version of the story while simultaneously losing the 2 people who had anchored my entire understanding of home was a compound loss that did not have a clean shape. It was not something you could explain in a single conversation or resolve with a long cry and a good night's sleep. It was something you carried with you to the grocery store and through every Tuesday afternoon, shelving library books while the rest of the world went about its business without any awareness of the specific weight you were transporting. I became very good at compartmentalizing, at putting the grief in its drawer when I needed to function, and opening it only in the hours when I had safety to do so. That is not the same as healing, but It is what surviving looks like when healing has not yet had the time and space to begin. I reached out to the family's estate attorney the following Monday. Her name was Margaret Osei. She had handled my parents' affairs for years, a composed and precise woman who had always struck me as someone who said exactly what she meant and meant exactly what she said. I introduced myself and explained that my father and mother had both recently passed, and I was calling to ask about next steps. She said she was very sorry for my loss. She said she would be in touch with all relevant parties about scheduling a will reading within the next few weeks, as soon as the necessary documentation was in order. I asked, carefully, whether she could tell me anything at this point about the general outline of the estate. She said she was not in a position to discuss specifics before the formal reading, but that she wanted me to know, and I noticed she chose those words specifically. She wanted me to know that I would be receiving a full notice and that my presence at the reading was important. I thanked her. I sat with what she had not said for a long time after I hung up. Something in the way she'd said, "Your presence is important," stayed with me. It was not standard attorney language. It was intentional. I did not let myself hope too much on the basis of 5 words, because hope in a season of grief is a fragile thing, and I could not afford to have it broken. But I held it quietly, like a small flame in cupped hands. I was out of the house in 11 days. Not because I accepted Nathan's timeline. I didn't, and I told him so, but because staying there while Cassandra reorganized my mother's kitchen and discussed paint colors with a contractor on the phone in the living room was a specific kind of pain that I could not sustain without it doing damage to me that I was not willing to allow. I had watched Cassandra move through my mother's house in those 11 days with the efficient detachment of someone who saw square footage where other people saw life. She had rearranged the living room furniture by day 3. By day 7, a box of my mother's decorative items had appeared in the hallway with a sticky note that said donate in Cassandra's handwriting. My mother's ceramic birds, the cross-stitch sampler she had made the year Nathan and I were both in elementary school. A set of cobalt blue glass bottles she kept on the kitchen windowsill because the light hit them in the afternoon and threw small blue shadows across the counter, and she had loved that small daily beauty for 30 years. In a donate box, a week after the funeral, I took the glass bottles. I took the cross-stitch. I took my father's maintenance log. I took the things that mattered, and I packed what I could fit in my car, and I stored the rest in a unit I rented on the south side of town, and I drove away from Clover Ridge Road on a Thursday morning without looking back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew if I did I wouldn't be able to keep driving, and I needed to keep driving more than I needed the comfort of looking back. I moved into a rented room in a shared house in the River Arts District. It was not glamorous. It was small, a single room with a window that faced a brick wall, and a shared kitchen that smelled like whoever had cooked last. The other tenants were 2 graduate students and a musician who kept mostly nocturnal hours and played guitar quietly enough that it didn't bother anyone. My rent was $360 a month, which was what I could manage on my freelance bookkeeping income while I figured out how to expand my client base. I put my grandmother's quilt on the narrow bed. I set the cobalt blue bottles on the windowsill, even though there was no direct afternoon light, and they threw no shadows. I set my father's maintenance log on the small desk. I was 27 years old, and I was starting over from a foundation of grief in a room the size of my parents' walk-in closet. And I want to be honest with you about how that felt. It felt like the ground had been taken out from under me so completely that I had to relearn what solid felt like. But here is the thing about people who have spent years being quietly reliable. They already know how to function without applause. I had been doing that for 3 years, getting up, making coffee, managing medications and appointments and household repairs, and my mother's anxiety and my father's pride, and the 1,000 invisible logistics of keeping 2 aging, ill parents comfortable and dignified in their own home. None of that had come with recognition or a standing ovation. I had done it because it needed doing, and because I loved them, and because I was there. That same engine, quiet, unglamorous, functional, was the thing I ran on in the months after I left the house. I got up. I worked. I expanded my bookkeeping clients through referrals, then through a modest online presence Dara helped me set up. I took on a part-time position at the Asheville Library on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, shelving and cataloging, which I had applied for partly for the income and partly because libraries had always been the kind of place where my particular quality of quietness felt like an asset rather than an absence. It was at the library that I met Liam Okafor. He was a high school art teacher who came in on Thursday afternoons to pick up new art history books for his classroom and had a habit of getting distracted by whatever was on the new arrival's shelf and losing 20 minutes to reading the first chapter of something he hadn't planned on reading. I noticed him before he noticed me because noticing things quietly was something I had always been good at. He had the particular quality of someone who is completely comfortable being absorbed in something, no performance of it, no self-consciousness, just genuine engagement with whatever was in front of him. I found that quality striking after a season of people who were very concerned with being seen correctly. We started talking over a photography book one Thursday afternoon and kept talking until the library was close to closing. He did not try to fix my situation or offer advice I hadn't asked for. He asked questions and listened to the answers and asked follow-up questions, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most people realize. Over the next several weeks, we had coffee twice, walked along the river once on a Saturday, and exchanged long text conversations about everything from the ethics of urban planning to whether cilantro was genuinely divisive or just performed as divisive online. He made me laugh in the particular way that means the laughter is coming from somewhere real. I was careful with it. With him, because I was in no condition to be anything other than careful, and he seemed to understand that without needing it explained. He showed up consistently and without pressure, and in a season where almost everyone I had counted on had either left or let me down, consistency was the most attractive quality a person could possess. I heard from Nathan twice in those months. Once in January, a brief text asking if I had received correspondence from the estate attorney. I said I had, that the will reading was being scheduled. He said okay, let him know when the date was confirmed. The text had the energy of a business communication. Nothing personal in it, no inquiry about how I was doing, no acknowledgement of the fact that we had both lost our parents, and that we were the only 2 people in the world who had lost exactly these parents and might, theoretically, have wanted to grieve together. I wrote back with the date. Once I had it, he confirmed he would be there. The second time he contacted me was a week before the reading. A brief call, Nathan's voice carrying the slightly elevated quality it gets when he is managing his own nerves while pretending to be straightforward. He said he just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page going in. I said I was sure the attorney would make sure of that. He said, right, of course. There was a pause. He said he hoped this wouldn't be difficult. I said I thought it would probably just be whatever it was, and that we would handle it. He said yes, and we said goodbye. The night before the reading, I did not sleep particularly well, which I had expected. I lay in the narrow bed in my River Arts room and looked at the ceiling and thought about my parents, not about the will or Nathan or the house or any of the logistical machinery that had consumed the past months. Just my parents. My father at the kitchen table on weekend mornings with his coffee and his crossword puzzle, the way he held the pen at a precise angle, the way he said, when he got a clue he liked. My mother on the back porch in the summer, deadheading the roses she grew along the fence, humming something that was never quite any specific song. The sound of their voices, the weight of them in a room. I had been so busy surviving their loss that I had not always had space to simply miss them. And on that night before the reading, I let myself miss them without any other agenda. I cried, and then I got up and made tea, and I sat at my small desk, and I wrote them both a letter that no one will ever read but me. I told them what the past months had been. I told them I was okay. I told them I hoped they knew they were loved every single day of the years I spent in that house with them. I folded the letter and put it in the same envelope as the first card my mother had ever sent me at college, which I had kept in the inner pocket of my travel bag for years without ever examining why I kept it there. I think I knew on some level that I might need it near me. The reading was on a Wednesday at 10 in the morning at Margaret Osei's office on Lexington Avenue, a clean, quiet space with wood floors and the kind of orderly bookshelves that signal a person who takes their work seriously. I arrived 8 minutes early. Dara had offered to drive me, and I had let her, and she was parked outside with coffee and her particular brand of steady presence that I had come to think of as one of the most reliable things in my life. I sat in the waiting area and I breathed slowly and I kept my hands flat on my knees and I did not let myself think about outcomes. Whatever was in that document was already written, had been written, was finished. The only thing left was to hear it. Nathan arrived with Cassandra, which I had not expected, but probably should have. She was dressed as if attending a meeting that required impressions to be made. Fitted blazer, structured bag, a posture of calm expectation that told me she had fully decided how this was going to go. Nathan nodded at me when they came in. I nodded back. Nobody hugged. That told you everything about where we had landed as a family in the months since December. Uncle Roy arrived a few minutes later, my father's closest friend, who had been close to Nathan since childhood and had, during the weeks following the funeral, made his loyalties relatively clear through whose calls he returned and whose he didn't. He sat beside Nathan. I sat across the table. It was a small room, and the distance between us was not large, but it felt deliberate and final, like the gap between two things that had once been connected and were now permanently separate. Margaret Osei entered precisely at 10. She was a woman of maybe 60, natural gray hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, the bearing of someone who had sat in exactly this kind of room many times and had long ago made peace with the fact that the truth she carried was not always the truth people had come in expecting to receive. She set down a leather portfolio, offered water, which Nathan declined, and I accepted. And then she sat and looked around the table and said, "I want to thank you all for being here. I know this is a difficult time for the family, and I'll do my best to make this as clear as possible." She opened the portfolio. She found the document. She put on her reading glasses. The will had been updated 8 months before my parents died. I did not know this. I want to be precise about that. I had not known this, had not been told, had not participated in or influenced it in any way. My parents had made an appointment with Margaret Osei's office, and they had updated their will on their own terms, in their own time, for their own reasons. What Margaret read made the room very quiet very quickly. The financial accounts, a modest amount, the accumulated savings of two people who had lived carefully for 40 years, were split evenly between Nathan and me. The house, however, the house on Clover Ridge Road, the house with the dark green porch chairs and the cedar smell and the coat rack my father had built, and the kitchen where my mother had once baked bread on Saturday mornings. The house was left in full to me, to Violet and Hargrove, with language in the document specifying clearly that the decision reflected my sustained presence, care, and sacrifice during my parents' final years, and that it was their explicit wish that I receive and retain the property without contest. Nathan made a sound that was not quite a word. Cassandra's hands, which had been resting on the table, pressed flat against the surface in a way that communicated the full weight of what she was processing. Uncle Roy looked at the table. I looked at Margaret Osei, and she looked back at me, steady and calm, and I understood that she had known when she called and told me my presence at this reading was important, exactly what she was telegraphing. I had not been wrong to hold that small flame carefully. Nathan said, I'm sorry, can you read that section again? Margaret read it again. Same words, same unambiguous language. He said, when was this changed? She told him, 8 months prior. He said, did Violet, was she involved in this change? Margaret said, I had not been present at the appointment and had not been informed of the revision. Nathan looked at me, then really looked at me for what felt like the first time in the entire morning, and I watched him working through the mathematics of it. 8 months ago, when he had visited once in 6 months, when I had been in that house every single day, when my father had been struggling with the stairs, and my mother had been recovering from her stroke, and I had been the one there quietly without a trumpet or a headline or any particular recognition. I did not say anything in that moment. I want you to understand that very clearly, I did not look at Cassandra. I did not look at Uncle Roy. I sat with my hands in my lap and my shoulders straight, and I let the document speak because that is what documents are for. My parents had been two people who did not always say the right thing at the right time. My father had difficulty with direct emotional expression, and my mother had her complicated politics of family loyalty that had not always served me well. But 8 months before they died, they had sat in this attorney's office, and they had made sure, deliberately, legally, permanently, that what I had given was acknowledged. They had made sure the record was correct, even when they were no longer going to be here to defend it. That act of quiet, advanced love, that is the thing that broke me open, right there at that table, in the most controlled way I have ever been broken open. My eyes filled, and I let them fill, and I did not wipe them away quickly, that I let them fall. Margaret Osei then said there was one additional item. She reached into the portfolio and removed a sealed envelope. She said that my mother had left a letter to be read at the will reading in the event of her death, addressed to me. She asked if I would like her to read it aloud, or if I preferred to receive it privately. I said she could read it aloud. I said it quietly, but I said it without hesitating. Nathan said nothing. I think he understood that some moments have already been decided, and the only dignified thing left is to be present for them. Margaret cleared her throat and began. My dear Violet, if you are hearing this, then Margaret is reading it, which means your father and I are gone, and I hope more than I can say that you are not sitting in that room alone. You were never supposed to be the one who stayed. I know that. I know it was not fair to ask it of you. Even though I did not ask, you simply did what you have always done, which is show up before anyone else notices it needs doing and stay until the thing is done. I watched you give 3 years of your life to keeping this family's home a home, and not once did you do it in a way that made us feel like a burden, even on the days I know we were one. Your father could not always say the things he felt. You know that better than anyone. But in the last year of his life, he told me more than once that the greatest comfort he had was knowing you were there. Not anyone else. You. I am leaving you the house because it already belongs to you in every way that matters. You filled it back up when it was emptying. You kept the lights on. You kept us. The legal document only says what has been true for a long time. I hope you live in it with joy, Violet, the way it deserves to be lived in. I hope you plant things in the backyard and let them get a little wild, and don't worry too much about what the neighbors think. I hope you put music on in the mornings. I loved you the most completely of anything I ever did. Take good care of yourself. My girl, take very good care. Mom. The room was silent when Margaret finished. Fully, completely silent. I was crying in the way that is past the point of being managed or hidden, steady, quiet tears, the kind that come from somewhere deeper than sadness alone. From being known. From having been seen by the people who mattered most, even when you had started to wonder if you had been. Nathan was looking at the table. I think he was also doing something with his eyes that he did not want anyone to see, and I chose not to look directly at him because that was the right thing to do, and because whatever he was feeling in that moment was between him and the parents we had both lost, not between him and me. When the meeting concluded and paperwork had been reviewed and the formalities handled with Margaret's steady professionalism, I stood and picked up my bag. Nathan stood too. We were in the lobby, the 4 of us briefly together in that awkward geography of an ending, and Nathan said my name. I turned. He looked like a man who had prepared a version of this conversation that had been rendered obsolete and was now navigating without a script. He said, I didn't know about the will. I said, I know. He said, I handled things badly after they died. The house, telling you to leave. He stopped. He looked somewhere slightly past my shoulder in the way people look when they are trying to locate something honest inside themselves, and it takes a moment to find. He said, that was wrong. He said it plainly, not with dramatic self-flagellation, not with a list of justifications attached. Just, that was wrong. I looked at him for a moment. My brother, 2 years older than me, shaped by the same parents, the same house, the same set of Thanksgiving dinners and summer drives and ordinary years that had somehow produced 2 such different responses to the same crisis. I said, I know you were grieving too. I know you didn't know how to be in it. He nodded. I said, but Nathan, I needed my brother, not a landlord. I needed my brother, and you weren't there. He absorbed that. He did not argue it. That was, in its own way, a kind of answer. Cassandra was standing a few feet away, and her posture had something different in it than it had when she'd arrived. Less certainty, more self-consciousness, the look of a person recalculating. I did not have a conversation with Cassandra that day. Some reckonings need to happen in stages, and that one was further down the road than I had energy to reach for on that particular Wednesday. Uncle Roy caught me at the door. He said he was sorry. I said I heard him. He said he should have been more present for me over the past months, that he had let Nathan's version of the story become the one he operated from without asking for mine. I said that was true. I said I appreciated him saying so. I did not tell him it was fine, because it wasn't, and I was done, permanently done, with managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own accuracy. He squeezed my shoulder. I thanked him and walked out into the November morning, which was cold and clear and smelled like leaves and something faintly sweet that I couldn't identify. And Dara was leaning against her car across the street with 2 coffees and an expression on her face that told me she already knew something significant had happened, the way she always knew things. And when I reached her and she looked at my face, she just handed me the coffee and pulled me into a hug and held on, and I let her, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. I moved back into the house on Clover Ridge Road in early December, almost exactly a year after my mother had died. Nathan and Cassandra had vacated it by the time the legal transfer was complete. They had been staying there intermittently in the months since the funeral, which had its own separate weight that I chose to process in private, and then set down because I could not carry every piece of it indefinitely. I pulled into the driveway on a gray Tuesday morning and sat in the car for a while before going in. The dark green porch chairs were still there. Cassandra had replaced the cushions with something neutral and expensive looking, but the chairs were still the right color, and I thought my mother would have had an opinion about the new cushions that would have been delivered with the particular precision she reserved for things that were almost right but not quite. That thought made me smile. Inside, the house had been changed in ways I had expected, and some I hadn't. The living room furniture was different. The kitchen had new handles on the cabinets. The hallway had been repainted a color that was inoffensive and entirely wrong for the house. I walked through every room slowly, not in grief, but in the way that you walk through a place you are reclaiming, touching walls, standing in doorways, letting yourself exist fully in each space before moving to the next. My mother's kitchen windowsill was bare. I unpacked the cobalt blue bottles from the box in my car and set them back where they belonged. The afternoon light was at the wrong angle by then. It was too late in the day, but I stood there anyway and looked at them sitting there in the familiar window. And I told myself, tomorrow the light will be right, and it will hit them, and there will be shadows, and that will be enough. The coat rack my father had built was still in the hallway. They had left it, whether by oversight or some unexamined instinct toward leaving that particular thing alone. I hung my coat on it. Then I sat down on the floor of the hallway, the same hallway where Nathan had told me to start looking for somewhere else to go, and I put my back against the wall, and I looked at the photographs that were still hanging, the ones they hadn't gotten to, my family, in all its complicated, ordinary, imperfect history, and I breathed, just breathed, long and slow and full. The house settled around me the way old houses do. The furnace clicked on. Something in the kitchen ticked. The light through the front window stretched long and amber across the wood floor. I was home. After everything, after the grief and the displacement and the months in the rented room and the waiting and the uncertainty, I was home. It has been 2 years since that afternoon in the hallway. The backyard garden is, as my mother instructed, a little wild. I planted dahlias in the spring and lavender along the fence and a kitchen herb bed just outside the back door that I am overly proud of considering how basic it is. I have painted the hallway back to its original color, a warm off-white that I matched from an old photograph because some things should be restored rather than replaced. Liam comes over for dinner most Friday nights and has, with remarkable ease, become the kind of presence in this house that belongs there, not loudly, not with any particular fanfare, just steadily, in the way that things take root when the soil has been properly prepared. He has not been asked to change anything about himself and has not asked me to change anything about myself, which is the simplest possible description of a relationship working the way it should. Nathan and I are finding our way back to something, not what we were. That version of a relationship had too many unexamined assumptions built into its foundation, but something more honest, built on the cleared ground of what happened and what was said at that table in the lobby of Margaret Osei's office. He has come to Asheville twice. Once for a weekend in March, once in the summer. He walked through the house both times with a kind of careful attention that was different from anything I had seen from him before, like a man trying to learn something he should have known earlier. He and I have dinner when he's here, and we talk about our parents in the way that siblings can, when both of them are willing to stop defending their separate versions of the story and start building a shared one. It is slow. It is imperfect. It is, I think, real. My freelance bookkeeping practice has grown into something that sustains me comfortably. I still work Thursday afternoons at the library, not for the income now, but because I love it, because I love the quality of quiet in that building and the specific satisfaction of putting the right book in a person's hands and the way time moves differently in a room full of other people's stories. I have my father's maintenance log on my desk, and I have started keeping one of my own for the house, a record of what was fixed, what was updated, what the furnace's age is, and when the gutters were last cleared. It makes me feel like him in the best possible way. It makes me feel like the house is being properly tended, like I am doing the thing he did, now that I am the one responsible for the doing. I put music on in the mornings. My mother would be pleased. I put it on loud enough to fill the kitchen while I make coffee. And sometimes I dance a little badly because no one is watching. And even if they were, I have reached the age and the particular depth of hard-won peace where I do not need to perform dignity. I just need to live it. The cobalt bottles catch the light in the afternoon and throw small blue shadows across the counter, the same way they always did, the same way they did when my mother stood at that window and loved that small daily beauty without ever explaining it to anyone. I understand it now, or maybe I always understood it and just needed time and loss and a coat rack and a letter read aloud in a quiet room to finally be certain that I did. If you have made it all the way here, thank you for being present for this story. If any part of it found you, I hope you hold on to it. And I hope you know that the things you do in love, even when no one seems to be watching, are never as invisible as they feel. Sometimes the people who matter most are already writing it down. The lesson this story carries, What Happened to Violet, is a story about the kind of sacrifice that doesn't make any noise, the kind that happens in quiet hallways and early mornings and late nights, in the 100 invisible acts of care that keep a family held together when it is coming apart. Nobody gave her a standing ovation for the 3 years she spent in that house. Nobody made a fuss about the appointments she managed, the medications she tracked, the moments of dignity she protected for two people who were losing theirs slowly and did not want it remarked upon. She simply did the work. She stayed. And the deepest truth of this story is that her parents saw it, had always seen it, and they made sure that seeing was recorded in the most permanent way available to them. Sacrifice made in love is never invisible, even when the living refuse to acknowledge it. even when the people around you move on as if your presence cost nothing and your absence would cost nothing either. The people who truly knew you, who watched you, who were held by you, they see it. And sometimes they find ways to say so that arrive long after you stopped expecting them to. How to apply this to your own life. If you are the one in your family who stays, who shows up, who handles the logistics, who keeps things running while others are elsewhere, I want to say something to you directly. Your presence is not invisible just because it goes unannounced. You may not receive the Santorini tickets or the celebration dinner or the acknowledgement at the table, but the people you show up for know. They know in the way that people know things they cannot always say, in their bones, in their relief when you walk through the door, in the specific comfort of your specific presence when things are hard. Do not stop showing up because it goes unremarked. Do the thing because it is right and because you love the people you are doing it for. That is its own reward, and it is a real one, even when it doesn't feel like it. At the same time, and this matters equally, protect yourself. Violet held her dignity when Nathan told her to leave. She did not collapse. She did not beg. She cried privately. And then she got up and made a list, and she kept her spine straight through every single month that followed. You are allowed to feel the injury of being overlooked or displaced or treated as less than you are. Feel it fully, and then get up. Keep building. Keep doing the work that reflects who you actually are, not who someone else has decided you must be. And finally, document your life. Not obsessively, not for a courtroom, but for yourself. Keep the records of what you've done and who you've loved and what you've given. Not because you will need to prove it one day, but because the act of recording your own life is an act of self-respect. It is how you tell yourself that what you are doing matters, even on the days when no one else seems to agree. It matters. You matter. The light catches the glass bottles every afternoon, whether you are watching or not. But watch when you can. It is worth seeing.